At my son's engagement party, he turned to his wealthy future in-laws and said, "My father is just a warehouse worker. He spends his days counting boxes because he was never capable of building anything greater." The entire room laughed at me. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Please, father, don't embarrass us in front of our guests." I lowered my head and said nothing. Then the door suddenly swung open. A group of the company's senior attorneys walked in alongside the chairman of the board of directors. The entire room fell instantly silent. "Welcome to Dad's Revenge Stories. I'm deeply thankful for your presence here. Tell me in the comments which city or country are you tuning in from. Please note, elements of this story are fictionalized for artistic and thematic purposes. Parallels to external identities are purely coincidental, though the underlying wisdom is entirely meaningful." The room smelled of hothouse gardenias and something older beneath them. The kind of money that does not need to announce itself because it has been present long enough to become part of the walls. Whitfield Estate sat at the end of a private drive in McLean, Virginia, behind iron gates and a half-mile of elm trees that had been planted before I was born. The chandeliers alone were worth more than my first laboratory. I know this because I had once looked them up back in the years when I was the kind of man who received invitations to places like this rather than directions to the service entrance. That evening, I arrived through the front door. Not because anyone expected me to, because I still remembered which door was mine. My name is Robert Mercer. I am 70 years old. I spent 35 years building Hayes Biomedical from a single patent application filed in a rented office in Stamford, Connecticut, into a pharmaceutical company worth $4.2 billion. I created 47 patents. I hired the scientists, signed the leases, negotiated the first investor agreements on a folding table with a borrowed pen. I know every hallway of the company's main facility because I designed the floor plan myself in the winter of 1994, working from a set of architectural drawings spread across my kitchen floor, while my wife Margaret kept the coffee coming and told me I was going to change the world. She was right. She usually was. For the past 5 years, I had been working in the company warehouse as an inventory manager. I counted shipments, reconciled manifests, and made sure the loading dock ran on schedule. My colleagues knew me as Robert, not Mr. Mercer, not the founder. Just Robert, the older man on the morning shift who always brought an extra thermos and never complained about the cold. My son Carter had become CEO 6 years earlier. He was 42 sharp and deeply certain that everything Hayes Biomedical had become was the result of his own vision. He had introduced me to his fiancée's family as his father, the warehouse employee, in a tone that suggested the two words did not belong in the same sentence. That introduction had taken place 11 minutes before the moment I am describing now. Carter stood at the center of the Whitfield ballroom in a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly salary. His fiancée Diana stood beside him in a dress the color of champagne, one hand resting lightly on his forearm. The way women rest their hands on things they are afraid someone else might try to pick up. Her father, Edward Whitfield, occupied the space to Carter's right, with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 68 years deciding what is worth his attention and has concluded that very little is. "My father," Carter said, gesturing toward me with a looseness that I recognized as practiced casualness, "has spent the last several years managing inventory at one of our facilities. Counting boxes mostly. Keeping things organized." He smiled. It suits him. He was never really built for anything larger. The laughter that followed was not cruel. That was almost worse. It was the comfortable laughter of people who had no reason to question what they had just been told, people for whom a man in a warehouse uniform at a party like this was simply a detail that confirmed the natural order of things. A few guests glanced at my jacket, the dark green logistics uniform I had worn deliberately that evening, and then glanced away with the practiced discretion of the very wealthy. Diana leaned toward her father and spoke close to his ear. Edward Whitfield's eyes moved to me, once measured and brief, and then returned to his son-in-law with the finality of a door being closed. I stood where I was. I did not shift my weight. I did not reach for a drink from the nearest passing tray, though I wanted one. I had spent 3 decades learning to be still inside chaos, and whatever this room was, it was not chaos. It was something smaller. It was a family deciding in public what shape they wanted my life to take. Senator William Cross appeared at the far edge of my vision. He was a tall man with the careful posture of someone who had spent 20 years being photographed and had learned to make it look effortless. Carter had invited him to Edward Whitfield, and the senator had accepted because Carter had written a significant check to his education initiative the previous spring. These were the transactions that kept rooms like this running. The senator's eyes found me across the ballroom. Something shifted in his face. He began moving in my direction, with a purpose that cut through the slow social drift of the other guests. Carter saw him coming and moved to intercept, but Senator Cross had already extended his hand toward me. "Robert Mercer," he said, "I have owed you a conversation for 12 years. Carter stepped between us, smooth and immediate. "Senator, let me get you a drink. There are some people I want you to meet." The senator looked at Carter the way experienced men look at interruptions. "In a moment," he said, and kept his hand extended toward me. I shook it. Diana appeared at my left shoulder before the handshake ended. She had a way of moving through a room that suggested she had mapped every exit and entrance before arriving. Her voice when she spoke to me was low and precise. "Please," she said, "try not to make this evening difficult. You've already drawn enough attention simply by dressing the way you have. These are important people. My father has worked very hard to be here, and Carter has worked even harder. Whatever point you think you're making, I am asking you as his future wife to let this night belong to them." Her perfume was expensive. Her certainty was more expensive still. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at my son, who was steering Senator Cross toward the bar with one hand and had not looked back at me. "I understand," I said. She seemed satisfied with that. She returned to Carter's side and the room resumed its movements around me. Glasses rising and falling, voices layering over voices, the small orchestra near the garden doors, working through something that was probably Sinatra. I checked the clock above the fireplace. It was 9:47. I had been in this room for 11 minutes. 3 minutes later, something changed at the end of the hallway. I heard the door before I saw it move. The first morning I reported to the warehouse, I arrived 20 minutes early. Old habit. I had arrived early to everything for 40 years, early to investor meetings, early to board presentations, early to the hospital. The night Carter was born, sitting in a waiting room chair, with a cup of vending machine coffee going cold in my hands, while the most important thing in my life was happening 20 feet away behind a closed door. Arriving early was how I managed the fact that I could not control what happened next. It gave me time to study the room before the room started studying me. The warehouse was on the eastern edge of the Hayes Biomedical Campus in Gaithersburg, Maryland, Building 7. I had approved the construction budget for it in 2003. The loading dock faced northeast, which meant it caught the wind off the parking lot in winter, and I had noted that in the original facilities report and recommended additional insulation for the roll-up doors. Someone had not followed through on that recommendation. Standing at the dock entrance on my first morning, I could feel exactly where the insulation was missing. The shift supervisor that morning was a woman named Patty Okafor. She was 55 years old, built like someone who had been doing physical work her entire life and had made peace with it. And she looked at me the way experienced people look at new arrivals, not unkindly, but without any particular faith that I was going to be useful. "You done warehouse work before?" she asked, handing me a scanner and a clipboard. "Not exactly," I said. "What's that mean?" "It means I understand the systems. I just haven't run them from this end." She studied me for another moment, then made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You'll either figure it out fast, or you'll slow everybody down. We don't have room for slow." "I won't be slow," I said. She handed me a vest, bright orange reflective strips across the shoulders, and pointed me toward the receiving bay. "James will show you the intake process. Don't touch anything until he walks you through it." James Calloway was 28, tall, and possessed of the particular energy of a young man who had learned early that enthusiasm was more useful than waiting to be noticed. He shook my hand with both of his, which I had not expected, and launched immediately into an explanation of the intake manifest system, with the practiced fluency of someone who genuinely loved what he was doing. I listened. I asked no questions for the first 40 minutes, though I had several. The intake system. James was describing the cross-referencing of digital manifests against physical shipment, tags, the reconciliation windows. The exception flagging protocol was a system I had designed in 1995 with a logistics consultant named Frank Deering, working from a model I had sketched on a legal pad after reading 3 separate academic papers on pharmaceutical supply chain integrity. We had spent 11 weeks refining it. I had presented it to the board as part of a broader operational overhaul that had reduced shrinkage losses by 31% in the first year. James did not know any of that. He knew the system the way a person knows a road they drive every day fluently, practically, without needing to understand who laid the asphalt. "The key thing," he said, tapping the scanner against his palm, "is the reconciliation window. You've got a 4-hour window from the time the truck logs in to clear every line item. If you miss the window, the system flags it, and compliance gets an automatic alert. Whoever designed this system built that flag in specifically. Nobody really knows why they set it at 4 hours instead of 6, but that's how it's always been. 4 hours is enough time to catch a discrepancy without giving anyone enough time to correct it before it's recorded," I said. James looked at me. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, that's exactly right." "How'd you know that?" "Lucky guess," I said. By the end of the first week, I had settled into the rhythm of the shift. My body, which had spent decades behind desks and in conference rooms, complained about the standing and the lifting in ways I chose to interpret as useful information rather than warning signs. Patty revised her opinion of me upward by small increments, which I found more satisfying than I had expected. James began consulting me on reconciliation problems that were giving him trouble, and I helped him work through them without explaining how I knew what I knew. On the third Friday, I was reorganizing a section of shelf units in the back of the warehouse when I found a binder wedged behind a support column. It was old, the cover warped from what looked like a water leak at some point in the previous decade. Inside were printed inventory protocols from 2004, standard operating procedures. At the bottom of each page in the footer was a line that read, "Approved and authored. Mercer founder and CEO Hayes Biomedical Inc." Someone had gone through every page with a black marker and crossed out that line. Not the content, not the procedures themselves, which were still in use, still being followed every day by people who had no idea who had written them. Just the name. Just the 8 words in the footer that said who had built the thing they were all standing inside. My chest tightened in a way I had not felt since the morning Margaret's doctor called and used the word irreversible. I stood in the back of the warehouse with the binder in my hands, and I understood with a clarity that required no further evidence that what Carter had been doing was not passive. It was not neglect. It was not the ordinary forgetfulness of a busy man who had moved on to other things. It was deliberate. Someone had gone through the trouble of removing my name. That told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. The company cafeteria on the third floor of the main building had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the campus courtyard, and in the fall, the maple trees outside turned a color that Margaret had always called embarrassingly beautiful, as though nature were showing off. I ate lunch there most Tuesdays, not because the food was remarkable, but because the light was good, and nobody from the warehouse ever came up to the third floor unless they had a reason. I had no reason. That was the point. Patty Okafor had started joining me in the spring of 2022, after she figured out I was going up there and decided without asking that she would come along. She never explained why. I never asked. Some work friendships operate on the understanding that the reasons do not need to be spoken to be real. She was unwrapping a sandwich across from me on a Tuesday in October when Carter and Diana walked in. They did not see us immediately. The cafeteria was large enough, and we were seated near the windows where the light came in at an angle that washed out the details of the room for anyone walking in from the bright corridor. Carter had his hand at the small of Diana's back in the particular way he had adopted after they got engaged, a gesture that looked like affection, but functioned more like direction. He steered her toward the coffee station at the far end of the room. They began to talk. The language they spoke was French. Patty looked up from her sandwich. She glanced at me, then at Carter and Diana, then back at me. "What are they saying?" she asked quietly. "I'm not sure," I said. This was not true. In the fall of 1982, I was 28 years old and had recently completed a research fellowship at the Institut Pasteur in Paris, where I had spent 14 months working on protein synthesis models that would eventually form the theoretical basis for 3 of Hayes Biomedical's early patents. I had arrived in Paris speaking no French and left speaking it well enough to argue with a pharmacist, negotiate a lease, and follow a scientific lecture without losing the thread. The French I had learned was not elegant. It was functional, precise, and deeply embedded in a part of my memory that age had not touched. Carter was saying that the restructuring proposal needed to be moved before the fourth quarter audit, because once the auditors got into the subsidiary accounts, the transfer windows would close and the whole arrangement would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Diana was saying that her father's legal team had already prepared the holding company documentation and that the only remaining variable was timing. Carter said the timing depended on one thing. Diana asked what? Carter said the old man in the warehouse. Diana laughed. The laugh was not loud. It was the kind of laugh that exists between two people who have shared a private understanding for long enough that the joke no longer needs to be explained. Then Diana said in French, her voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who had grown up spending summers on the Côte d'Azur. "He doesn't understand a word of what we're saying. He never has. He's been standing in the same place his whole life while the world moved past him. Men like that, they're useful when you're building something. Once the thing is built, they just become part of the furniture." Carter glanced across the cafeteria in our direction. His eyes moved over me without stopping, the way eyes move over furniture. He looked away. I picked up my coffee cup. My hand was steady. I had learned to make my hands steady a long time ago in rooms where steadiness was the only currency that mattered, and I spent it carefully. Patty was watching me with the focused attention she usually reserved for manifests that were not reconciling properly. "You okay?" she asked. Fine, I said. You sure? Because you've got a look on your face like somebody just walked across your grave. It's nothing, I said. Old memory. And it was in a way. The Paris I was remembering was not the Paris of candlelit restaurants and wide boulevards, though I had walked those boulevards more times than I could count. The Paris I was remembering was a basement laboratory in the 5th arrondissement, a November night in 1982, with rain against the high windows and the smell of reagent and cold coffee. A 28-year-old version of myself bent over a notebook with a pen that kept running dry, working on a problem that no one had been able to solve, driven by nothing more complicated than the need to understand how things worked at their most fundamental level. I had not gone to Paris to become someone. I had gone because the work was there. Everything that followed the company, the patents, the $4 billion, the son who was now standing 40 feet away, discussing how to move my life's work out from under me while I sat eating lunch. All of it had grown from that basement and those notebooks, and the particular stubbornness of a young man who did not know yet that some problems were not supposed to be solvable. Diana was laughing again at something Carter had said. The sound of it reached me across the cafeteria like something physical. I finished my coffee. I folded my napkin. I stood up, collected my tray, and nodded to Patty, who was still watching me with that careful, measuring expression she had worn on my first day in the warehouse. She was wrong about many things, Diana, but she had been right about one. I had been standing in the same place my whole life. I just happened to be the one who built the floor. In 1989, I had $35 in my checking account, one patent application pending with the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and a name for a company I had not yet registered. The name came first. That was always how it worked with me, the shape of the thing before the substance of it, the container before the contents. I wrote Hayes Biomedical on a yellow legal pad one evening in November, while Margaret was asleep upstairs, and I stared at it for a long time, the way you stare at something that feels more true than you expected it to. Then I underlined it twice, which was something I did when I was certain, and went to bed. The garage in Stamford was unheated. By December, I had run an extension cord from the house and set up a space heater that glowed orange in the corner and made a ticking sound every few minutes that I eventually stopped hearing, the way you stop hearing a clock. My workbench was a door I had taken off its hinges and laid across two sawhorses. My equipment in those first months was borrowed, rented, or purchased, used from a university surplus sale in New Haven, where I had driven on a Saturday morning in a borrowed pickup truck and spent 4 hours in a parking lot loading centrifuges and spectrophotometers into the bed, while a graduate student who needed the money helped me wrap them in moving blankets. Margaret brought coffee out to the garage every morning at 6. Not because I asked her to. She simply appeared, coat over her robe, 2 mugs in her hands, and sat on the metal stool I kept near the workbench and drank her coffee while I worked. She did not always talk. Some mornings she sat in complete silence for 20 minutes and then went back inside to get ready for her day. And those mornings were among the best of my life. Her presence was a form of belief that required no words to be understood. In February of 1990, the patent application came back with a request for additional documentation. I spent 11 days rewriting the technical specifications. In April, Gerald Hartman called. Gerald was 40 at the time, a decade older than me, and he ran a small life sciences investment group out of an office in Westport that smelled of pipe tobacco and old carpet. He had read about my fellowship research in a trade publication and tracked down my phone number through a contact at Yale. He called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was elbow-deep in a protein assay and spoke for 3 minutes without pausing, laying out with the precision of a man who had spent 20 years identifying which ideas were worth money, exactly why he thought mine was. "I don't fund concepts," he said. I fund people. You want to tell me why you're the right person for this? Because I already know what the mistakes are going to be, I said. I've been making them for 8 months. I know which ones matter and which ones you can work around. There was a pause. Come in Thursday, he said. I drove to Westport on Thursday in a car that needed a new alternator and parked 2 blocks from Gerald's office so he would not see it. We talked for 3 hours. He offered me a seed investment of $400,000 contingent on the patent approval and a business plan delivered within 30 days. I drove home with the windows down in February air and called Margaret from a payphone outside a gas station in Norwalk because I did not yet own a cell phone. We're going to need a real office, I told her. I know, she said. I've been looking. Thomas Ellison came later in the spring of 1992 after the first patent had been approved and a second was in progress. Thomas was a quieter man than Gerald, more deliberate, the kind of investor who read everything twice and asked his questions at the end rather than interrupting. He had made his first significant money in medical devices and understood the pace of pharmaceutical development, the way people understand weather, not with pleasure, but with the resignation of someone who has learned that certain things cannot be hurried. He sat across from me in the first real Hayes biomedical office, a rented suite on the 4th floor of a building in Stamford that smelled of fresh paint and possibility, and he looked at my research files for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. Who else knows how to do what you do? He asked. Nobody yet, I said. That's the point. He nodded once, slowly, the way Thomas always nodded when he had made up his mind. Then we should move quickly, he said, before someone figures it out. By the year 2000, we had 11 patents. We had a staff of 63. We had moved into a purpose-built facility in Gaithersburg that I had designed myself down to the placement of the loading dock on the northeast corner, and we had signed our first major licensing agreement with a European pharmaceutical company for a compound that would go on to generate more revenue in its first 3 years than everything else we had built combined. Margaret came to the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new facility. She stood beside me while a photographer from the trade press took pictures I would never see printed in anything she read, and she held my hand with both of hers the way she had held it the night Carter was born. One day, she said quietly, watching the crowd of employees moving through the new building, your son may not fully understand what it took to build all of this. I hope I'm wrong about that. I told her she was wrong. Standing in the cafeteria 34 years later, watching my son look through me like I was a window, I understood that she had not been wrong about anything. She had simply been kind enough to hope. Carter was 9 years old the first time he walked into the laboratory on a Saturday morning and asked me what I was doing. I was running a gel electrophoresis test, which is a process for separating protein molecules by size using an electrical current passed through a gelatin-like medium. It is painstaking work that requires a specific kind of patience, not the passive patience of waiting, but the active patience of watching, of holding your attention. Steady on something that is moving too slowly to see move until suddenly it has moved. I told Carter this. I told him all of it, the science and the patience both, because I had always believed that children deserve accurate explanations rather than simplified ones. He pulled the stool up to the bench and watched for 40 minutes without speaking. When the test was finished, he asked 3 questions. The first was about the electrical current. The second was about why the molecules separated by size rather than by type. The third was whether the same principle could be applied to something other than proteins. That third question was a good one. It was the kind of question that came from a mind that was already looking past the thing in front of it toward the thing beyond. I told Margaret that evening that Carter was going to be a scientist. She smiled into her coffee cup in the way she smiled when she thought I was missing something obvious. He's going to be whatever makes him feel like he matters, she said. Right now, that's you. Pay attention to who it becomes later. I did not pay enough attention. Carter grew up in the company, the way military children grow up on bases, knowing the language, knowing the hierarchy, understanding instinctively that the place had a logic of its own that preceded him and would outlast him. He interned in our research division at 17. He studied biochemistry at Penn and then got his MBA from Wharton, which was his idea and not mine, and which I supported because I believed then that wanting different tools than your father used was not the same as rejecting what your father built. I was 31 when he met Diana Whitfield at a fundraising dinner in Georgetown. I was not there. Margaret was, and she called me afterward from the car. He met someone, she said. Good, I said. I was reading a licensing proposal and only half listening, which is something I have thought about many times since. Robert. Her voice had a quality I recognized, the careful flatness she used when she was saying something she wanted me to actually hear. She's very beautiful, very confident. Her father is Edward Whitfield. I know who Edward Whitfield is. I know you do. I'm telling you anyway. A pause. She looked at Carter the way certain people look at things they've decided to acquire. I put down the licensing proposal. What did Carter look like? Margaret was quiet for a moment. Like someone who had just been told for the first time that he was extraordinary, she said, and believed every word of it. Diana entered our lives, the way weather enters a house when someone leaves a window open gradually and then all at once until you cannot remember what the air felt like before. She was intelligent and relentless, and she understood with a precision that I came to find unsettling exactly which levers moved people. She did not dislike me. Dislike would have required her to think about me more than she did. I was simply a variable in an equation she was solving, and she had already determined that my value in that equation was negligible. The sentence that changed everything was one I did not hear directly. Carter told it to me himself 3 years after the wedding, during one of the dinners we still had occasionally at the house on Birchwood Drive where he had grown up. We had been talking about the company's expansion into Southeast Asian markets, and I had raised a concern about regulatory timelines, and Carter had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual thoughtfulness. Diana thinks, he said carefully, that as long as you're involved in decisions, people will assume the ideas are coming from you. I set down my fork. She thinks, he continued, not quite meeting my eyes, that I need to establish my own identity separate from the company's founding history. That the story of Hayes Biomedical needs to become my story, not ours. The dining room was warm. Outside, the November wind moved through the birch trees that gave the street its name, a sound like paper being shuffled by someone in another room. I had eaten at that table for 20 years. I had built the company that paid for the house that contained the table. I had watched my son grow from a 9-year-old, asking careful questions about protein separation, into the man sitting across from me now repeating, in his own careful words, something his wife had taught him to believe. Is that what you think? I asked. He picked up his fork. I think she has a point, he said. 6 months later, Carter was named CEO. I was offered a position on the advisory board, with a title that meant nothing and a role that meant less. I declined without explanation. I called Gerald Hartman that evening and told him what I intended to do instead. Gerald was quiet for a long time. The warehouse, he said finally. Yes, Robert. His voice was the voice of a man choosing his words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. Are you sure? Margaret always said I needed to understand how things worked from every angle. I said. I never did get to the warehouse. he exhaled. How long? As long as it takes, I said. There was another silence. Then Gerald said very quietly, I'll make sure the right people know where to find you when the time comes. I thanked him and hung up the phone. I sat in the kitchen of the Birchwood Drive house for a long time after that, listening to the November wind move through the trees outside, thinking about a 9-year-old boy on a Saturday morning who had asked exactly the right questions. I had answered all of them. I just had not anticipated that someone else would spend the next decade teaching him to forget. The thing about a system you designed yourself is that you know exactly how it is supposed to breathe. Not the technical specifications. Those are written down, codified, available to anyone with clearance to read the operational manual. I mean the rhythm of it. The way numbers should move through the intake manifests in the morning and settle into the reconciliation logs by afternoon. The way exception flags should appear rarely, and when they do appear, they should make sense: a damaged shipment, a mislabeled carton, a vendor error that traces back to a single point of origin. Exceptions have explanations. That is what makes them exceptions rather than patterns. In the fall of 2022, I started seeing patterns. It began with a Tuesday morning intake in late October. A shipment of raw compound materials had arrived from our supplier in North Carolina, 48 cartons documented on the digital manifest as delivered in full. I processed the intake, scanned each carton, and logged the receipt. By the time I ran the afternoon reconciliation, 3 cartons had disappeared from the active inventory without a transfer record, a disposal notation, or a quality rejection flag. They were simply gone as cleanly as if someone had reached into the database and lifted them out with 2 fingers. I flagged it as a discrepancy and submitted the exception report through the standard channel. By the following morning, the report had been closed. The resolution note read, "Clerical error corrected at source. No further action required." I printed the report and put it in the bottom drawer of my workstation under a road atlas of Maryland that had been sitting there since before I started. The second incident happened 3 weeks later. A different shipment, a different supplier, the same clean disappearance from the active inventory log. This time, 11 cartons. The exception report was closed within 6 hours. Clerical error corrected at source. James Calloway found me in the back of the warehouse that Friday afternoon, recounting a section of shelving that did not need recounting. "You doing the math again?" he asked. He had developed an instinct for when I was working through something which I attributed to the fact that he was observant in the particular way of young people who have learned that paying attention is the best available substitute for experience. "Just checking my work," I said. He leaned against the shelf unit and crossed his arms. "Those exception reports you've been filing, somebody keeps closing them out same day." I looked at him. "You noticed that?" "Hard not to. In 3 years here, I've never seen a same-day close on a physical inventory discrepancy. Usually takes at least a week for compliance to review." He paused. "Who has the authority to close exception reports without a compliance review?" "Senior Operations Management," I said, "or anyone they delegate that authority to." James chewed on that for a moment. "That's a pretty short list." "Yes," I said, "it is." I did not tell James what I had already begun to understand, because understanding it and being able to prove it were 2 different things, and I had spent enough years in boardrooms to know that the distance between those 2 points was where careers went to die. What I understood was this: the cartons were not disappearing because of clerical errors. They were being systematically redirected, physically removed from the main inventory, and transferred to a location that did not appear in the primary database, which meant it was either a subsidiary facility or an off-book operation entirely. In pharmaceutical logistics, raw compound materials have a street value that most people outside the industry do not appreciate. The compounds we were receiving were not finished medications. They were precursor materials, the building blocks from which active pharmaceutical ingredients are synthesized. In sufficient quantities, they could be reprocessed, resold, or used to manufacture product lines that would never appear on Hayes Biomedical's official books. I went home that evening and spent 3 hours with a legal pad and a calculator working backward from the exception reports I had saved. The numbers I arrived at extrapolated across the 18 months. I had been tracking discrepancies, suggested a total diversion of materials worth somewhere between $1.8 and $2.4 billion at current market rates. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at that number for a long time. Then I thought about Carter at 9 years old, asking careful questions about protein separation and about Margaret telling me to pay attention to who he would become. I thought about the yellow legal pad where I had written Hayes Biomedical for the first time, underlining it twice because I was certain. I thought about the extension cord running from the house to the unheated garage and the orange glow of the space heater in December, and the 48 months I had spent building something from the specific belief that it was worth building. $2.4 billion. Not stolen in the dramatic way that people imagine theft, not carried out in bags, not transferred in a single transaction that would trigger every alarm in the system simultaneously. Taken slowly, carefully, in quantities, small enough to be explained away as clerical errors by anyone with the authority to close exception reports without a compliance review. My son was dismantling everything I had built one line item at a time. I opened the bottom drawer of the kitchen cabinet, where Margaret had kept her recipe cards, and removed the yellow legal pad I had been using to track the discrepancies. I wrote the date at the top of a new page. Beneath it, I wrote a single sentence. I had spent 35 years building something. I was not going to spend the next year watching it disappear. The evening I worked out the $2.4 billion figure, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time before I picked up the phone. I was not calling a lawyer. I was not calling Gerald Hartman, though I had considered it. I was calling a man named Raymond Stokes, who had been the director of financial research at Hayes Biomedical until 18 months earlier, when Carter had terminated his employment on a Thursday afternoon with 2 weeks of severance and a non-disclosure agreement that Raymond had signed because he had a daughter starting college in the fall and a mortgage on a house in Rockville and no immediate alternative. I had known Raymond for 11 years. I had hired him myself in 2010, recruited from a pharmaceutical auditing firm in Boston, where he had spent 8 years developing a reputation for finding things that other people's accounting departments preferred to keep unfound. He was methodical, honest, in the specific way that made certain executives uncomfortable and possessed of a memory for financial detail that I had come to rely on, the way you rely on a good instrument, not because it tells you what you want to hear, but because it tells you what is actually there. Carter had fired him in the spring of 2021, 14 months before the evening I was sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad full of numbers that told a story I did not want to be true. The official reason given was restructuring. The actual reason, which Raymond had told me in a parking garage in Bethesda 3 weeks after his termination, was that he had flagged a series of financial irregularities in the subsidiary accounts during a routine internal audit and submitted a formal concerns report to the compliance officer. The compliance officer had forwarded the report to Carter. Raymond had been called into Carter's office the following morning. I drove to Bethesda that December evening in 2022, the legal pad on the passenger seat beside me. Raymond lived in a rented apartment on the 3rd floor of a building near the metro station, a significant reduction from the house in Rockville that he had sold 8 months after losing his job because the mortgage payments had become unsustainable. He had not found work in the industry. Carter had been thorough about that. 2 phone calls to the right people, at the right firms, a carefully worded conversation at an industry conference, and Raymond Stokes had become the kind of candidate that search committees passed over without explanation. He opened the door in a flannel shirt and reading glasses, and for a moment he simply looked at me the way people look at things they have stopped expecting to see. "Robert," he said. "May I come in?" I asked. "I." He stepped back and let me in. The apartment was small and orderly, the kind of space arranged by someone who had learned to take comfort in the controllable things. There were books stacked on every flat surface. On the kitchen counter, a half-finished cup of coffee sat beside an open laptop, displaying a spreadsheet. Old habit, I thought. Some people cannot stop doing the work even when the work has stopped paying them. I sat at his kitchen table and placed the legal pad between us. He looked at the numbers for a long time, without touching the pad. His jaw tightened once a small movement, and then he exhaled through his nose and leaned back in his chair. "How long have you been tracking this?" he asked. "About 2 years," I said. "From the warehouse. The patterns started small. I didn't understand what I was seeing until the fall." He looked up at me sharply. "You've been in the warehouse this whole time?" "Yes." "Does Carter know?" "He knows I work there. He does not know what I have been doing while I work there." Raymond picked up the legal pad and studied it more carefully, turning pages, making small sounds under his breath that were not quite words. After several minutes, he set it down and removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. "This is bigger than what I found," he said. "What I flagged in the audit was maybe 300 million, maybe 4. This is—" He stopped. "This is the whole architecture. This is not an irregularity. This is a structure. Someone built this deliberately over a long period of time." "Yes," I said. "Carter built this." "I believe so." Raymond was quiet for a moment. Outside, a metro train passed on the elevated track 2 blocks away, the sound of it rising and fading, like something trying to get somewhere in a hurry. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "The audit report you filed," I said. "The original before it was forwarded to Carter, and anything else you kept." He looked at me steadily. "I kept everything," he said. "I kept it because I knew someday someone was going to need it. I just did not know it was going to be you sitting at my kitchen table asking for it." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and placed an envelope on the table beside the legal pad. Raymond looked at it without picking it up. "What is this?" he asked. "A monthly transfer," I said. "Backdated 18 months going forward until you find something appropriate. I should have done this when they let you go. I did not move quickly enough." He pushed the envelope back across the table toward me. "I don't want your money, Robert." "I know you don't," I said. "That's why I'm giving it to you." He looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he pushed it back once more, not toward me, but to the center of the table, equidistant between us. A compromise. "You said you were waiting," he told me. "In the parking garage. You said you were waiting for the right door to open." "Yes," I said. His eyes were steady and a little tired and entirely certain. "I think the door is open," he said. I picked up the legal pad. "Not yet," I said, "but it will be." I found the receipt on a Wednesday night in January, working a double shift because the regular night supervisor had called in sick and Patty had asked if I could cover. It was in the bottom drawer of the metal workstation at the back of the receiving bay, the one that nobody used, because the drawer stuck and required you to lift the handle at a precise angle while pulling outward, a mechanical idiosyncrasy that I recognized immediately because I had reported it to facilities management in 2004 and been told it would be addressed. It had not been addressed. 19 years later, the drawer still stuck in exactly the same way, and I still knew how to open it. Inside, beneath an expired incident report form and a dried-out marker, was a small paper receipt from a notary office in Stamford, Connecticut. I recognized the handwriting on the back before I recognized what the paper was. Margaret had tucked it into the pocket of an old coat I had left in Building 7 on my first week, a coat I had forgotten about entirely, until Patty had found it in the back of the supply closet and returned it to my workstation drawer without comment. The date on the receipt was March 14, 2010. The service listed was document authentication and secure storage transfer. The amount paid was $40. In the signature line at the bottom in the handwriting I would have recognized anywhere was Margaret's name. I sat down on the metal stool and held the receipt under the work light for a long time. March 2010. Margaret had been diagnosed in January of that year with the condition that would take her from us 4 years later. A slow and specific cruelty that the doctors described in clinical language designed to create distance from what they were actually saying. She had not told me about the diagnosis for 3 weeks, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to understand it fully herself before she brought it to me. That was Margaret. She processed things privately and then arrived at conversations already knowing what she thought, which meant that by the time she told me she was sick, she had also already decided how she wanted to handle it. In March of 2010, while I was flying between Gaithersburg and a licensing meeting in Zurich, my wife had driven herself to a notary office in Stamford, authenticated a set of documents, and transferred them to secure storage. She had paid $40. She had not mentioned it to me. I knew who Christine Holloway was. She had been the company's lead outside counsel since 2007, a precise and careful woman who spoke in complete sentences and billed in 6-minute increments, and had never in 15 years of working together given me a reason to doubt either her competence or her discretion. She had attended Margaret's funeral. She had stood near the back of the church in a dark coat and left before the reception, which I had thought at the time was professional courtesy. I understood now that it might have been something else. I called her from the warehouse at 11:47 at night. She answered on the second ring, which told me she kept her phone on her nightstand, which told me she was the kind of person who expected that important calls did not wait for business hours. "Robert," she said. Not a question. "You knew she was going to call someday," I said. A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding what to say, but the pause of someone who had been waiting a long time to say it, and was taking one final moment to make sure they got it right. "She told me you would call when you were ready," Christine said. "She said you would know what you were looking for before you found it, and that when you called, you would already understand most of what I was going to tell you." My chest tightened, the way it had tightened in the warehouse when I found the binder with my name crossed out. But this time the feeling was different. It was not anger. It was something closer to grief folded around gratitude, the particular sensation of being understood by someone who is no longer there to be thanked for it. "What did she send you?" I asked. "A sealed envelope," Christine said. "Inside the envelope is a document portfolio. I have not opened it." Her instructions were explicit. The portfolio is to be opened only in the presence of the board's legal counsel at a time when the company's founding documents are under active dispute. Another pause. "Are the founding documents under active dispute, Robert?" "Not yet," I said. "But they will be." Christine was quiet for a moment. Outside the warehouse, a truck was idling at the loading dock, its engine a low, steady vibration I could feel through the floor. "She also left a letter," Christine said. "A personal one addressed to you. She asked me to read you one line from it if you ever called. Just one line. She said you would know what to do with it. My throat tightened. Go ahead, I said. I heard Christine take a breath. Then, in the careful, measured voice of a woman reading words that were not hers. He has always known how to wait for the right moment. Trust that he still does. I sat with that for a long time, the receipt in one hand and the phone in the other. The warehouse quiet around me, except for the idling truck and the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. 14 years. She had written those 14 years ago and left them with a woman she trusted to deliver them at the right moment, because she had known with the particular certainty of someone who loved a person completely that there would be a right moment, that I would find it, that I would call. Don't open the portfolio yet, I said. I won't, Christine said. When? I looked at the receipt in my hand. $40. Stamford, Connecticut. March 14th, 2010. My wife preparing for a future she would not be alive to see, making sure I would not have to face it without her. You'll know, I said. Carter called on a Tuesday morning in late September, 3 weeks before the party. I was in the middle of a reconciliation run on the morning intake when my personal phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. Not the warehouse communication device, but the older phone I kept for calls that had nothing to do with inventory manifests. I saw Carter's name on the screen and finished logging the current line item before I answered, which took approximately 40 seconds, which I knew he would notice and which I did not mind him noticing. Dad, he said. The word had developed over the years a quality I could not quite name. Not cold exactly, but load-bearing in the wrong direction, as though the syllable were doing work it had not been designed for. I wanted to make sure you had the date. October 18th. The Whitfield Estate in McLean. I have it, I said. Diana's family is hosting. It's a combined event, the company anniversary and the engagement announcement together. A pause. It's going to be a significant evening. Important people. I understand. I just want to make sure we're on the same page about... He stopped. I could hear him choosing his words, the way people choose footing on a staircase they are not certain will hold. About the nature of the evening. It's a formal event. Black tie. Diana's father has invited several major investors and 2 members of the governor's board. I'll dress appropriately, I said. Another pause longer this time. Good. That's good. He said it the way people say things they are not entirely sure they believe. I'll have someone send you the address. I know the address, I said. I approved the zoning variance for that property in 2007 when the Whitfields expanded the East Wing. Gerald Hartman asked me to sign off on it as a professional courtesy. The silence that followed had a particular texture. Right, Carter said finally. Of course, I'll see you there. He ended the call before I could respond, which was something he had been doing for several years and which I had come to understand was not rudeness, so much as the conversational equivalent of leaving a room before the temperature could change. I stood at the reconciliation terminal for a moment, after he hung up looking at nothing in particular. Then I put the phone back in my pocket and finished the morning intake. Thomas Ellison called 2 days later. We met the following Saturday at a diner in Rockville that had been open since 1987 and served coffee in ceramic mugs that were too heavy to be elegant and too reliable to be replaced. Thomas had been coming to this particular diner since before I met him, and he had been ordering the same breakfast for 30 years, 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, black coffee, no substitutions. There was something I had always found steadying about a man who knew exactly what he wanted and did not feel the need to vary it. I was already in the booth when I arrived, his coat folded on the seat beside him, the coffee already poured. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, which had been at a board function 2 years earlier, where we had exchanged 14 words and a handshake. But his eyes were the same, the careful measuring eyes of a man who had spent 60 years deciding what was worth his attention. October 18th, he said before I had fully settled into the booth. Carter told me, I said. I know he told you. Thomas wrapped both hands around his mug. I'm telling you something different. I've spoken to 9 of the 14 primary shareholders. They will all be at the Whitfield estate on October 18th. I looked at him. Carter invited them. Carter invited 4 of them. I invited the other 5. He picked up his coffee and looked at me over the rim of the mug with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is entirely comfortable with it. They deserve to see who actually built this company, Robert. They have been told a version of the story for 6 years that is missing most of the important parts. I am correcting that. Thomas, I said carefully, I need you to understand that I am not doing this for the reaction in that room. I know you're not, he said. That's why I'm doing it for you. We sat with that for a moment. The diner moved around us, the way diners move on Saturday mornings slowly, with the particular comfort of people who are not in a hurry and have nowhere more important to be. Gerald is coordinating with Christine Holloway, Thomas said. Raymond Stokes will be available if needed. The portfolio your wife left with Christine. I don't know what's in it, but Gerald tells me it exists, and that's enough for me. I nodded once. There is one more thing. Thomas set down his mug and looked at me directly in the way he had looked at my research files in 1992, with the full attention of someone who intended to understand what he was seeing. Carter is planning to announce a major acquisition at the party, a deal worth $800 million. Gerald has seen the term sheet. Robert, the acquiring entity, is a holding company registered in Delaware 18 months ago. Gerald ran the beneficial ownership disclosure. He paused. Carter is the sole beneficial owner. The ceramic mug in my hands was warm and heavy. Outside the diner window, a family was crossing the parking lot. 2 small children running ahead of their parents. The parents walking fast to keep up, all 4 of them moving in the loose, uncoordinated way of people who are happy and not thinking about it. He is planning to sell the company to himself, I said, at a valuation that would transfer the majority of shareholder equity to the holding company within 18 months of closing, Thomas said. Yes. I set the mug down. Then we cannot wait until after the party. No, Thomas said. We cannot. I looked out the window for a moment. The family had reached their car. The children were climbing in, still running, still in a hurry to get somewhere. Their parents were slower, more deliberate moving, with the patience of people who understood that some things could not be rushed, and that knowing the difference was most of the work. I know what I am going to wear, I said. Thomas looked at my warehouse jacket folded on the seat beside me and said nothing. He did not need to. I drove myself to McLean, not because I did not have other options, but because I had always driven myself to things that mattered, and this mattered in ways I was still working out as I turned off the interstate and onto the tree-lined roads that led toward the Whitfield estate. The October night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the air feel precise, and the elm trees along the private drive had gone gold, in the way elm trees go gold in Virginia in the second week of October, which is earlier than most people expect and more complete than most people are prepared for. I was wearing my warehouse jacket, the dark green logistics uniform with the reflective strips across the shoulders, and the Hayes Biomedical Inventory Management badge clipped to the left breast pocket. I had pressed it that morning, which had taken longer than pressing a suit would have taken because the fabric was not designed to hold a crease and required patience and a specific angle of iron that I had worked out through trial and error over 5 years of wearing it. It looked when I was finished exactly like what it was. I did not want it to look like anything else. The security guard at the gate studied my jacket for a moment before he checked the list. He checked it twice, running his finger down the column of names with the careful attention of someone who understood that his job tonight was to make sure the wrong people did not get in. He found my name on the second pass and waved me through without a word, but I saw his eyes follow the jacket in my rearview mirror as I drove up the approach. A valet came forward as I pulled up to the entrance. He was young, 20 at most, in a white shirt and black vest, and he looked at my car, a 7-year-old Subaru with a dent in the rear quarter panel from a loading dock incident in 2021 that I had never gotten around to having repaired with the professional neutrality of someone trained not to react. He took my keys without comment. I liked him for that. The foyer of the Whitfield estate smelled of white roses and catered food, and the particular atmospheric pressure of a room full of people who have arrived somewhere they believe they deserve to be. A string quartet near the staircase was working through something I recognized as Debussy, played with the competent pleasantness of musicians hired for ambiance rather than revelation. Crystal caught the chandelier light. Women in soft colors moved through the room carrying glasses of champagne that cost more per bottle than a warehouse worker's daily wage. I was the only person in the room wearing green. Carter found me before I had crossed the foyer. He materialized from a cluster of guests near the fireplace, champagne in hand, moving with the particular velocity of a man who has spotted a problem and intends to manage it before it becomes visible to people he is trying to impress. His jaw was set in the way I had seen it set since he was 12 years old and had been caught in something he could not talk his way out of. "Dad!" He positioned himself between me and the room, his back to the guests. "What are you wearing?" "My work clothes," I said. His jaw tightened further. "This is a black tie event. I told you to dress appropriately." "I dressed appropriately for who I am," I said. "I am the inventory manager for Hayes Biomedical Building 7. This is what I wear to work." He stared at me for a moment, with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, and not embarrassment exactly, but something compounded from both of them. Plus a third thing I could not name that lived somewhere behind his eyes and had been living there, I suspected, for longer than either of us wanted to acknowledge. "Come with me," he said. "I think I'll stay here," I said. He held my gaze for 3 more seconds. Then Diana appeared at his side, arriving with the silent efficiency she brought to situations that required management. Her hand touching his arm in a way that looked like affection and functioned like redirection. She looked at my jacket once, a single comprehensive assessment, and then looked at Carter. "Introduce him," she said quietly. "Get it over with." What followed was the most efficient social execution I had witnessed in 50 years of attending events where social executions occurred with some regularity. Carter led me to where Edward Whitfield stood with 3 men I recognized as board-adjacent investors, men who attended company functions and wrote checks and understood that their role was to be present rather than to lead. Carter put his hand briefly on my shoulder in the way a person touches something they are about to set down. "My father," he said, addressing the group. "He manages inventory at one of our warehouse facilities, counting boxes, keeping things moving." A smile that did not reach his eyes. He was never really built for the boardroom. Some people are better suited to the ground level. There's real value in that. Edward Whitfield looked at my jacket the way he had looked at my car in the rearview mirror of my imagination, since Thomas had described him to me with the flat, assessing gaze of a man who priced things automatically and had already arrived at a number. He said nothing. He did not need to. His silence had the texture of a verdict. One of the board-adjacent investors laughed a short social sound, designed to ease the moment. Another raised his glass slightly, in a gesture that managed to be simultaneously inclusive and dismissive. The third looked at his phone. Carter had already begun to turn away. That was when Senator Cross saw me. I was across the room near the garden doors, deep in conversation with two men in dark suits. But his eyes moved in the way the eyes of experienced politicians move at events like this, continuously cataloging, never entirely committed to any single point of focus. They found me across the width of the ballroom and stopped. He said something to the men beside him. They nodded. He began moving through the room toward me with the directional certainty of a man who has decided where he is going and expects the room to accommodate him, which it did, people shifting without quite knowing why to let him pass. Diana saw him coming. Her hand found my arm, her fingers closing with a pressure that was not gentle. She leaned close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath near my ear. "Whatever you think is about to happen," she said, her voice low and very controlled. "I need you to understand that this evening belongs to Carter, not to you. It has never belonged to you. Do you understand what I am asking you?" I looked at her. Her eyes were steady and bright, and completely certain, the eyes of a woman who had never once considered the possibility that she might be wrong about something that mattered. "I understand exactly what you're asking," I said. The clock above the fireplace read 9:47. 3 minutes later, the door at the end of the hallway opened. The door did not open dramatically. That was the first thing I noticed. There was no bang, no sudden intrusion of cold air from the hallway, no cinematic moment of hinges swinging wide to announce what was coming. The door simply opened the way doors open when the person on the other side has decided it is time and has no need to make a production of it. One moment it was closed. The next moment it was not. Gerald Hartman walked in first. I was 60 years old and moved like a man who had spent 4 decades deciding which rooms he wanted to enter and had never once been uncertain about his right to enter them. He wore a dark suit without a tie, which in a room full of black tie was either an oversight or a statement, and with Gerald it was never an oversight. His eyes moved across the room with the practiced efficiency of someone conducting an assessment, and when they found me standing near the fireplace in my green warehouse jacket, with Diana's hand still warm on my arm, from 30 seconds ago, something in his expression settled the way the needle of a compass settles when it has finally found north. Christine Holloway came through the door behind him, carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized as the kind used for documents that needed to remain flat and undamaged. She was dressed in dark gray, professional and unhurried, and she scanned the room the way lawyers scan rooms, looking not at people but at configurations, assessing where things stood in relation to each other, and what that meant for what came next. Raymond Stokes came last. He wore a suit that was slightly too large for him in the shoulders, the suit of a man who had lost weight since the last time he had needed to dress formally, and his face had the particular set of someone who has been waiting a long time for a thing and is now actively preventing himself from feeling it too soon. His eyes found mine across the room and held them for a moment. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage. He returned it. The string quartet had not yet registered that anything had changed. They were still playing Debussy, the notes falling into the room, like something that belonged to a different evening entirely. Gerald walked toward me. Not around me. Toward me. He moved through the clusters of guests, the way water moves through a space, not pushing, simply occupying, and the room adjusted around him without quite understanding that it had done so. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. "Robert Ting," he said, and shook it with both of his, which was something he had done since 1990 and which I had never once taken for granted. Carter was at my side before the handshake ended. He had crossed the room in 11 seconds, which I counted, and his arrival had the controlled urgency of a man who understands that something is happening, that he cannot stop but has not yet accepted that he cannot stop it. Gerald. His voice carried the specific register of a CEO addressing a board member at a social event, warm on the surface, load-bearing underneath. I wasn't aware you were attending this evening. I wasn't aware I needed an invitation, Gerald said pleasantly. I've been a primary shareholder for 32 years. These sorts of events have always included me. He glanced around the room. I see Thomas is already here. Good. Carter's jaw tightened in the way I had watched it tighten all evening. But this time there was something different. Underneath it, a flicker of something I had not seen on my son's face in many years. Not anger, not calculation. Something closer to the expression he had worn at 9 years old, when a laboratory experiment had produced a result he had not predicted and could not immediately explain. We need to talk about the acquisition, Gerald said. His voice had dropped, but not enough that the three people standing nearest to us, one of whom was Edward Whitfield, could not hear if they chose to. The term sheet that was circulated to the board this morning. Specifically, the beneficial ownership structure of the acquiring entity. Carter went very still. This is not the appropriate venue, Carter said. I disagree, Gerald said. The announcement was scheduled for this venue. The correction should happen in the same place. He looked at Carter steadily. The board has reviewed the term sheet. We have also reviewed the beneficial ownership disclosure. Carter, the acquiring entity, is registered to a holding company, of which you are the sole owner. You are proposing to sell Hayes Biomedical to yourself at a valuation that would transfer majority shareholder equity to your personal account within 18 months of closing. The string quartet finished their piece. In the silence between movements, Gerald's last sentence hung in the air of the Whitfield ballroom, with the particular weight of a thing that cannot be unsaid. Diana stepped forward. Her composure was extraordinary. I noted this with something that was not quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. Her voice when she spoke was controlled and precise. This is a private family event. Whatever concerns the board has about business matters can be addressed through the appropriate channels on Monday morning. The appropriate channel, Christine said, speaking for the first time, her voice carrying the measured clarity of someone who billed in 6-minute increments and wasted none of them. Is the one that prevents a transaction that would breach the fiduciary duty of the chief executive officer to the shareholders he represents. Under Delaware corporate law, a CEO cannot be both the seller and the buyer in a transaction of this scale without explicit shareholder approval obtained through a fully disclosed process. No such disclosure was made. No such approval was sought. Edward Whitfield had not moved. He stood 3 feet to my right, his champagne glass held at an angle that suggested he had forgotten it was there, and he was looking at his future son-in-law with an expression I recognized from 30 years of boardroom experience as the expression of a man who has just understood that he has been in a room with someone for a long time without actually seeing them clearly. Carter turned to me. It was the first time all evening that he had looked at me directly, without redirection, without the management of an audience between us. His face was stripped of the performance that had been sitting on it since I arrived, and what was underneath was younger than I expected, and more uncertain, and in a way that hurt more than any of the evening's preceding events, more familiar. "Did you do this?" he asked. I looked at my son for a long moment, at the 9-year-old, who had asked careful questions, at the man who had spent 6 years answering the wrong ones. "No," I said. "The truth did this. I just made sure it had somewhere to go." Carter opened his mouth. Then he closed it. The room had gone the particular quiet of a space where something true has just been said in front of people who were not prepared to hear it, and nobody had yet decided what happened next. Raymond Stokes stepped forward and placed a document folder on the side table nearest to Carter. "There is one more thing," Raymond said. Raymond's folder contained 47 pages, one for each patent. Gerald picked it up from the side table and held it for a moment without opening it, the way a person holds something they have been carrying toward a specific moment for a long time, and wants to be certain the moment has arrived before they set it down. Then he turned to face the room, and the room which had been holding its collective breath in the particular way of people who sense that something is happening that they do not yet fully understand, went entirely still. "I want to tell you about the man standing near the fireplace," Gerald said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Gerald Hartman had spent 40 years in rooms where the quality of attention shifted when he spoke, and he understood that volume was for people who were not certain they would be heard. He was certain. His name is Robert Mercer. He is 70 years old. He is wearing a Hayes biomedical inventory management uniform because for the past 5 years he has been working the morning shift in Building 7 of this company's Gaithersburg facility, reconciling intake manifests and training junior staff and making sure the loading dock ran on schedule. Gerald paused. He did this voluntarily. He did it because he wanted to see what his life's work looked like when no one knew whose work it was. The string quartet had put down their instruments. The catering staff near the garden doors had stopped moving. I counted 11 people in my immediate field of vision who were holding champagne glasses they had forgotten to drink from. In 1989, Gerald continued, Robert Mercer filed the first patent application that would become the foundation of Hayes Biomedical. I know this because I was the person he called when the application came back with a request for additional documentation, and I drove to his garage in Stamford on a February morning and sat on a metal stool and watched him work, and I understood within 40 minutes that I was looking at something that did not come along often. He opened the folder. 47 patents, filed between 1989 and 2019. 30 years of intellectual property, that is the reason this company exists. That is the reason the products in this company's portfolio exist. That is the reason every person in this room who holds Hayes Biomedical equity has anything to hold. Thomas Ellison stood up from his seat near the garden doors. He did not say anything immediately. He simply stood, which in that room at that moment was its own kind of statement. A man of 60 who had invested in this company before most of the guests in the room had heard of it, rising to his feet, the way people rise for things they believe deserve to be met standing. I invested in this company in 1992, Thomas said. I invested because of the man near the fireplace, not his son. He looked at Carter for a moment, then looked away, which was a more complete dismissal than any words he might have chosen. I want that on the record. Senator William Cross had been making his way toward me since before Gerald began speaking, moving through the room, with the unhurried persistence of a man who had decided where he was going and was not going to be redirected. He reached me as Thomas sat back down, and he extended his hand for the second time that evening, this time without Carter available to intercept it. 12 years ago, Senator Cross said loudly enough for the people nearest to us to hear, Hayes Biomedical funded a pediatric research initiative in underserved communities across 3 states. The research produced a treatment protocol that is still in use today. Robert Mercer designed that initiative personally and declined to have his name attached to it. He shook my hand. I have been waiting for an appropriate moment to say that in a room where it would matter. This seems like the room. I shook his hand. My throat was tight in a way I had not expected, and could not entirely manage, and I was grateful for the warehouse jacket, for its familiar weight across my shoulders, for the specific solidity of a thing I had worn for 5 years, and that had become, without my fully intending it, a kind of armor. Diana had not moved from her position near Carter. She was watching Gerald with the fixed attention of someone calculating rapidly and continuously whether there was still a move available to her. Her father, Edward Whitfield, stood 2 feet to her left, and the distance between them, which was not large in physical terms, had become in the past 4 minutes something considerably larger. Edward cleared his throat. It was a small sound, but in the quiet of the room it carried. "I owe an explanation," he said, addressing no one in particular, and everyone simultaneously, which was a skill that required practice, and which Edward Whitfield had clearly practiced. "I was introduced to Mr. Mercer this evening as a warehouse employee. I accepted that introduction without question." He looked at me. "I should have asked more questions. I have built my career on asking more questions. Tonight I did not, and I am aware of what that says about the assumptions I brought into this room." It was not an apology. Edward Whitfield was not a man who apologized in the same way that certain geological formations do not apologize for being what they are. But it was an acknowledgement, and from Edward Whitfield in that room on that evening, an acknowledgement was the more difficult thing to give. Carter had not spoken since asking me whether I had done this. He stood at the center of the room in his charcoal suit, champagne glass still in his hand, though I could see from the angle of his wrist that he had forgotten it was there. And he was looking at Gerald with an expression that had moved past calculation and past anger into something rawer and less managed that I recognized with a pain I had not prepared for as the expression of a man who is understanding something for the first time that he cannot unknow. Gerald closed the folder. "Carter," he said not unkindly, "the board will need to meet on Monday. The acquisition cannot proceed as structured. We will discuss the path forward at that time." He set the folder on the side table with the quiet finality of a thing completed. "Tonight, I think, is finished with its business." Carter opened his mouth. Then he closed it. In 30 years, I had watched my son talk his way through every difficult room he had ever entered. He had never once been in a room he could not talk his way through. Until now. Before I reveal the exact paper trail that brought this whole setup crashing down, type "still here" in the comments right now so I know you're writing this out with me. And a quick note, the upcoming section includes dramatized and fictionalized elements for story flow. If that's not your style, feel free to step away now. Christine Holloway did not raise her voice to get the room's attention. She simply placed her leather portfolio on the side table beside Raymond's folder, opened it to the first marked page, and began speaking in the measured cadence of someone who understood that precision was more persuasive than volume, and that the truth properly documented did not require theatrical presentation to do its work. "I want to address the financial record," she said. "Specifically the movement of corporate assets from Hayes Biomedical's primary operating accounts into subsidiary structures over the past 3 years." Raymond stepped forward and stood beside her, which was a small choreography. They had clearly worked out in advance the kind of coordination that comes from two people who have spent time preparing for a specific moment and trust each other enough to move through it without signals. "The figures I am going to describe," Christine continued, "come from internal audit records, subsidiary account disclosures, and a set of financial documentation that was preserved by Mr. Stokes during his tenure as Director of Financial Research prior to his termination in March of 2021. She looked at Carter directly. Mr. Stokes preserved this documentation because he believed correctly that it would be needed. Carter had recovered enough to arrange his face into something that resembled composure. He stood with his weight slightly forward, the posture of a man preparing to push back against something, and his jaw had the particular set I had watched all evening, tight, controlled, ready. Diana stood beside him, one hand resting on the back of a nearby chair, her posture unchanged, her expression. The expression of someone who has decided that composure is the only remaining option and is committed to it entirely. Christine turned to the third page of her portfolio and read a figure aloud. It was not $2.4 billion. It was 2.7. I had undercounted by 300 million working from the warehouse manifests alone. Raymond, who had access to the subsidiary account records I could not reach from Building 7, had found the rest. The room absorbed the number, the way rooms absorb things that are too large to be immediately processed, a collective stillness, a recalibration, a silence that was not empty, but densely full of people doing arithmetic and arriving at conclusions they had not been prepared to arrive at this evening. Edward Whitfield set his champagne glass down on the nearest surface. The small sound of crystal meeting marble was the only sound in the room for approximately 3 seconds. Christine turned to page 7. This line item, she said, indicating a figure on the page, represents a purchase made in February of this year from a luxury goods retailer in New York. The purchase was charged to Hayes Biomedical's discretionary operations account, a corporate account designated for business-related expenditures under a category description of client relations and executive presentation materials. She paused. The item purchased was a diamond ring. The retail value at time of purchase was $240,000. The room did not make a sound. Diana's hand resting on the back of the chair tightened. It was a small movement, the kind of movement that a person makes when they are exerting control over a larger movement that wants to happen. And I watched it with the attention I had brought to intake manifests and reconciliation logs for 5 years, the attention of someone who had learned that the smallest discrepancies were where the truth lived. Every eye in the room moved to Diana's left hand. The ring was extraordinary. I had noticed it when she arrived, the way you notice a light source in a dim room, not because you choose to look at it, but because your eye goes there automatically. It sat on her fourth finger with the settled authority of something that had always been there. A round, brilliant cut stone in a platinum setting, catching the chandelier light and returning it fractured and multiplied. $240,000. Charged to a corporate account as client relations materials. Edward Whitfield turned to look at his daughter. I had watched Edward Whitfield conduct 2 assessments this evening. The assessment of me when Carter introduced us, and the assessment of Carter when Gerald began speaking. Both had been swift, comprehensive, and final in the way that the assessments of experienced men are final. This third assessment, directed at his daughter, was different. It was not swift. It moved across her face and then to her hand, and then back to her face with the particular slowness of a man who is not gathering new information, but is instead revising an entire architecture of existing information, and the revision was costing him something. Diana met her father's eyes. For the first time all evening, she did not have a response prepared. "Diana," Edward said. His voice was very quiet. In the silence of the room, it reached every corner without effort. "Take it off." Diana's chin lifted by a fraction of an inch. Her jaw tightened in a way that was, I realized with a start, identical to the way Carter's jaw tightened under pressure. The same movement, the same muscle learned or borrowed, or simply arrived at through the same kind of internal architecture. She looked at her father for a long moment, with an expression that was not defiance exactly, but was the closest thing to defiance that a woman of Diana's particular discipline could produce when the situation had removed every other option. She did not take it off. But her hand had begun to tremble. Raymond leaned toward Christine and said something quietly. Christine nodded and turned to page 11, which I knew from the preparation we had done together contained the subsidiary transfer records, the documentation of where $2.7 billion had actually gone, and through what channels and over what timeline and under whose authorization. Carter took one step forward. "I want to speak," he said. "You'll have the opportunity," Gerald said from across the room, his voice carrying the specific quality of a statement that is not an invitation to debate. Monday morning, boardroom, 9 o'clock. He looked at Carter the way he had looked at me in the garage in Stamford in February of 1990, with the full and non-negotiable attention of a man who had made up his mind. "Tonight, I think you should listen." Carter looked at me. I looked back at him. Between us, across the width of the Whitfield ballroom, 35 years of everything that had been built, and everything that had been taken, and everything that had not yet been said moved in both directions at once, and neither of us spoke and neither of us needed to, because some distances are not crossed with words. Christine turned to page 11. I saw my daughter before she moved. She had been standing at the far edge of the room since before Gerald arrived near the doors that led to the garden, in a dark blue dress that I recognized as the one she had worn to her mother's memorial service 11 years earlier. Claire had a way of occupying space that Margaret had also had a quality of presence that did not announce itself, that simply existed, with a completeness that made the space around it feel more defined. She was 35 years old, and the quietest person I had raised, and the one who had always understood, without being told, that understanding a thing completely was more useful than reacting to it quickly. She was watching Carter. Not with anger. Not with the bright surface emotion that the evening had been generating in most of the people in the room. She was watching him the way she had watched things since she was small, with the full, unhurried attention of someone cataloging what they were seeing for a purpose they had not yet revealed. She reached into her bag. What she removed was a small black USB drive, the kind that cost $8 at any office supply store, and that contains, by its unremarkable appearance, no indication of what it might be carrying. She held it in her closed hand for a moment, looking at it, and the look on her face was one I had seen only a handful of times in 35 years of being her father, the look of someone who is about to do something that cannot be undone, and has decided after full consideration that it needs to be done anyway. She crossed the room. She did not walk quickly. She did not look at Carter as she passed him, though he was 3 feet to her left, and turned to watch her go by with an expression that shifted from confusion to something sharper and more alarmed as she continued past him toward Christine Holloway. She placed the USB drive in Christine's hand without a word, and Christine, who had clearly been expecting it, closed her fingers around it and nodded once. Carter took 2 steps forward. "Claire." His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before, not the managed warmth of a CEO addressing a subordinate, not the practiced confidence of a man who controlled the room. Something rawer. Something that lived underneath the performance and had been there, I suspected, since before Diana, since before the corner office, since the years when he and Claire had been children in the same house on Birchwood Drive, building things together in the garage on Saturday mornings. "Claire, what is that?" She turned to face him. "I found it 6 weeks ago," she said. Her voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have been held in place by considerable effort for a considerable time. "I was cleaning out the storage room on the 4th floor, the one that used to be Dad's office before you had it converted. There was a filing cabinet in the back corner that hadn't been opened in years. I opened it." Carter's face had gone the color of something that has had its blood supply interrupted. "Inside the cabinet," Claire continued, "there was a folder. Inside the folder were printed copies of emails. The emails were sent from your personal account to a domain registered to Meridian Pharmaceutical Group. She paused. Meridian is Hayes Biomedical's largest competitor. The emails contained internal research data development timelines and proprietary compound formulations that are covered under Hayes Biomedical's trade secret protections. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the October wind moving through the elm trees outside the garden doors, a sound like the careful turning of pages. "Carter," Claire said, and her voice broke slightly on his name in a way she did not try to conceal, which was the bravest thing I had seen anyone do all evening. "I found it by accident. I want you to know that. I was not looking for it. I did not go into that room to find something to use against you." Her eyes were bright with something she was working to contain. "I stood in that storage room for 20 minutes, holding that folder, before I decided what to do. I thought about putting it back. I thought about coming to you directly. I thought about pretending I had never been in that room." Carter said nothing. The color had not returned to his face. "I kept thinking about Dad," Claire said. "About what he built. About what you were doing to it." She stopped. She pressed her lips together for a moment, a gesture so familiar that it cracked something open in my chest, because it was the exact gesture Margaret had made when she was working to say something difficult and wanted to say it precisely. "I kept thinking that someone had to choose, and that if I didn't, I was choosing anyway." Christine plugged the USB drive into a laptop that Raymond had opened on the side table. The screen filled with a document that she enlarged and turned so that the people nearest to her could read it. The email at the top of the document was dated 8 months earlier. The subject line read, "Preliminary Discussion Compound Data Transfer." The first line read, "As discussed, I am prepared to provide the following materials in advance of our formal agreement." Carter looked at the screen. Then he looked at Claire. Then he looked at me. "Dad," he said. It was the first time all evening that the word had sounded like what it actually was. I crossed the room. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the particular deliberateness of a man who has been waiting for a long time to close a specific distance and understands that the closing of it matters as much as everything that has led to it. I stopped in front of my son and looked at him, at the face I had known for 42 years, at the person underneath the person he had been performing all evening, at the boy who had asked careful questions on Saturday mornings, and the man who had spent a decade forgetting why those questions had mattered. I put my hand on his shoulder. He did not move away. "I know," I said. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was something smaller and more necessary than either of those things, the acknowledgement that he was still underneath everything, someone I had held when he was hours old, and that this fact did not change regardless of what either of us had done with the years since. Behind me, Claire let out a breath that she had clearly been holding for 6 weeks. Nobody invited Patty Okafor to speak. That was the thing I kept coming back to afterward in the days and weeks that followed, when I replayed the evening, the way you replay things that mattered not to change them, but to understand what they were made of. Nobody called on her. Nobody introduced her. Nobody created a space in the proceedings for a 55-year-old warehouse shift supervisor in a church dress and sensible shoes, who had driven herself to McLean in a 10-year-old Honda, because she had overheard 2 board assistants talking in the 3rd-floor corridor 3 days earlier, and had decided without telling anyone that she intended to be there when whatever it was finally happened. And she had decided with the particular decisiveness of a woman who had spent 30 years making decisions that nobody asked her to make, that she intended to be there when it did. She stood up from a chair near the garden doors that I had not known she was occupying. The room had been in the process of absorbing everything that had happened in the past 40 minutes, the patents, the acquisition structure, the ring, the emails, my hand on Carter's shoulder. Claire's exhaled breath, and the absorption was still ongoing, people processing at different speeds, the way people always process things that arrive faster than their existing frameworks can accommodate. Into this ongoing absorption, Patty Okafor stood up, and the room noticed her the way rooms notice unexpected things, not immediately, but completely, once the noticing began. She was not a tall woman. She had the build of someone who had spent decades doing physical work and whose body had become over time a precise instrument of that work, compact, efficient, permanently upright, in the way of people who have never had the luxury of slouching. Her dress was dark green, which I noticed with a feeling I could not entirely name, because it was approximately the color of my warehouse jacket, and I did not think this was an accident. She looked around the room without apparent self-consciousness, taking in the chandeliers, and the catered food, and the women in soft colors, and the men in black tie, with the calm assessment of someone who has walked into many rooms that were not designed for her, and has long since stopped letting that fact determine how she occupied them. Then she looked at Carter. "I don't know who this man was before I met him," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that carries a voice trained by years of calling across warehouse floors, over the sound of forklifts and loading equipment. A voice that knew how to reach the back of a large space without straining. "I don't know about patents. I don't know about board meetings or acquisition structures or any of the things that have been discussed in this room tonight. I work the morning shift in Building 7. I manage intake manifests and I train new staff, and I make sure the loading dock runs on schedule, same as I have for 11 years. She paused. Someone near the fireplace had stopped breathing audibly enough for me to notice. "What I know," Patty continued, "is that 2 years ago a man named Robert joined my shift. He didn't tell me anything about himself except that he understood the systems, which turned out to be the understatement of my professional life." A sound moved through the room that was not quite laughter, but was adjacent to it, the sound of people recognizing something true. He showed up early every single morning. He covered shifts when people called in sick. He spent an hour one Tuesday in February helping James Calloway work through a reconciliation problem that had been giving the whole team trouble for a week, and he did it without once making James feel like he should have figured it out himself. James Calloway, I realized, was standing near the back of the room. He was 28 years old and wearing a jacket that was slightly too formal for him and slightly too informal for the room. And his expression was the expression of someone who has walked into a situation considerably larger than the one he had been told to expect, and is managing it with more grace than most people twice his age would manage it. Patty's eyes moved from Carter to Diana to Edward Whitfield, and in each case they did not linger because Patty Okafor had spent 55 years developing an instinct for where the attention in a room needed to go and where it was being wasted. Then she looked at me. "Last winter," she said, "we had a situation on the dock. A refrigerated shipment arrived 4 hours late, which put the entire morning intake behind schedule, which meant we were going to miss the reconciliation window, which meant compliance was going to get flagged, which meant 3 people on my team were going to have a very bad Tuesday." She stopped. Robert was supposed to end his shift at 7. He stayed until 11:30. He rerouted the intake sequence, absorbed the delay into the existing manifest without triggering the flag, and had the dock clear by noon. She paused again. He didn't tell anyone he'd done it. I found out 2 days later from James. When I asked Robert about it, he said, and I am going to quote him exactly, because I wrote it down when I got home that evening. "The work needed doing. The shift was ending. Those aren't the same thing." The room was quiet in a way it had not been quiet all evening. Not the stunned quiet of people processing financial revelations, not the loaded quiet of people calculating positions and allegiances, but something different and simpler, the quiet of people who have just heard something true, said plainly, and who recognize the truth of it, and who have nothing to add because nothing needs to be added. I don't know what this man did before Building 7, Patty said. I don't know what's in those folders, or what those emails mean, or what any of it is worth in dollars. She looked at Carter one final time, and her look was not unkind, which was somehow more devastating than unkindness would have been. But I know what he's worth every single morning when he shows up before the rest of us and makes sure the work gets done. And I know that a man like that does not deserve to stand in a room full of people who think they know him and be told he is something less than what he is. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for the length of time it takes for something true to finish settling. Then Claire, standing beside me, put her hand into mine and held it the way her mother had held it, at ribbon cuttings and board presentations and hospital waiting rooms, and every other moment that had mattered, with both hands, completely, without reservation. I looked at the ceiling of the Whitfield ballroom for a moment, because I needed to look somewhere that was not at another person's face. The chandeliers were extraordinary. I had always thought so. 3 weeks is not a long time. In pharmaceutical development, 3 weeks is the margin of error on a single assay. In corporate litigation, it is barely enough time to file a preliminary motion. In the life of a family, it is the length of a silence that has settled into something permanent, without either party having decided that it should. In the 3 weeks between the evening at the Whitfield estate and the special shareholder meeting convened for the 14th of November, the following things happened. Carter retained outside counsel. Diana moved into the guest suite of her father's house in Georgetown. Edward Whitfield issued a statement through his office, indicating that his family would have no further comment on matters pertaining to Hayes Biomedical. The board of directors placed Carter on administrative leave pending the outcome of the shareholder review. And Raymond Stokes, for the first time in 3.5 years, walked back through the front entrance of the Hayes Biomedical main facility in Gaithersburg and sat down at a desk in the financial research department with a temporary access badge and a mandate from Christine Holloway to reconstruct the complete picture of the subsidiary transfers. I drove to the meeting in the same 7-year-old Subaru with the dent in the rear quarter panel. I wore the warehouse jacket. The Hayes Biomedical boardroom occupied the northeast corner of the 6th floor of the main facility, which meant it looked out over the loading dock of Building 7. I had chosen that placement deliberately when I designed the floor plan in 1994, because I had wanted the people who made decisions about the company to be able to see if they chose to look the place where those decisions became physical reality. In 30 years, I was not certain that anyone had looked, but the window was still there. Gerald Hartman called the meeting to order at 9 o'clock precisely, which was the time he had specified to Carter 3 weeks earlier in the Whitfield ballroom, and which was the time Carter arrived with 2 attorneys and the particular bearing of a man who has spent 3 weeks preparing an argument and believes still that the right argument can change the outcome of anything. I was wrong about that. But I understood why he believed it. I had raised him to believe that preparation was the answer to most problems, which was true for most problems and was not true for this one. Carter sat at the far end of the conference table from Gerald. His attorneys flanked him, which gave his position at the table the appearance of a fortress, which I suspected was intentional. Christine Holloway sat to Gerald's right with the leather portfolio and 3 additional folders that had been prepared in the weeks since the party. Raymond sat beside Christine, a legal pad in front of him, covered in the dense, precise handwriting I remembered from 11 years of financial reports. Thomas Ellison sat across from them. Dr. Helen Marsh, who was 62 years old and had been a senior research scientist at Hayes Biomedical since 1997, and had worked directly with me on 6 of the company's 47 patents, sat at the end of the table nearest the window with her hands folded in front of her and an expression of composed determination that I recognized as the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in this room. I sat in the middle of the table, not at the head, not at the far end. In the middle, which placed me equidistant from every other person in the room, which was where I had always preferred to be when things that mattered were being decided. Gerald opened the meeting by summarizing the events of October 18th and the subsequent board actions. Carter's lead attorney interrupted twice. Gerald acknowledged both interruptions with the courtesy of a man who has no intention of being redirected by them, and continued without adjustment. Carter waited until Gerald had finished. Then he straightened in his chair, and the performance that I had watched assemble and disassemble over the course of the evening at the Whitfield estate had been reconstructed over 3 weeks into something more polished and more careful, and in its way more dangerous. "I want to address the characterization of my father's role in this company," Carter said. His voice was the CEO voice, measured, authoritative, designed to fill a room without appearing to try. "The founding history of Hayes Biomedical has been presented tonight in a way that significantly overstates my father's operational contribution relative to the growth that this company has achieved under current leadership. The 47 patents are historical assets. The company's current valuation is the result of strategic decisions made over the past 6 years. I want the record to reflect that distinction." The room absorbed this. Then Dr. Helen Marsh unfolded her hands. She did not stand. She simply placed both palms flat on the table and looked at Carter with the expression of someone who has held a very specific thing inside them for a very long time and has finally found the room where it belongs. "I have been a research scientist at this company for 27 years, she said. "I worked directly with Robert Mercer on the development of 6 patents, including the compound synthesis protocol that currently accounts for 31% of this company's annual revenue. I have sat in this building for 6 years and watched the founding history of Hayes Biomedical be systematically removed from internal communications presentations and institutional memory." Her voice was steady and precise and carried the weight of 27 years of mornings. "I have been waiting for an appropriate time to say that clearly and on the record. I believe this is that time." Carter looked at his attorneys. The lead attorney leaned toward him and said something quietly. Carter nodded. "The record," he said, "will also reflect the financial irregularities that have been alleged, which my legal team intends to address through the appropriate." "The record," Christine said, opening the first of her 3 additional folders, "will reflect the complete financial documentation that Mr. Stokes has reconstructed over the past 3 weeks. The total figure inclusive of the subsidiary transfers, the unauthorized asset dispositions, and the discretionary account misappropriations is $2.9 billion. The number landed in the room the way large numbers land when they are spoken aloud in spaces where people understand what they mean, not with drama, but with weight, the specific gravity of a figure that has moved from abstraction into consequence. Carter's lead attorney put his pen down. The other attorney looked at his phone, then put it face down on the table. I reached into the bag beside my chair and placed a binder on the table. It was 3 inches thick and contained 35 years of patent filings, founding agreements, board resolutions, licensing contracts, and financial records going back to a seed investment receipt from Gerald Hartman, dated February of 1990. On the cover, in the plain label that Christine had affixed it, read, "Hayes Biomedical Founding Documentation, R. Mercer." I did not open it. I did not need to explain it. I simply set it on the table in the middle of the room where everyone could see it, and I left my hand resting on the cover for a moment and then I moved my hand away. Carter looked at the binder for a long time. Then he looked at the window. Through the glass, 6 floors below the loading dock of Building 7 was visible in the gray November morning light. A truck was backing in. A figure in a green jacket was directing it from the dock arms, moving in the careful, practiced signals of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had done it many times before. James Calloway, running the morning intake, the work continuing. Gerald called for the vote. It was not close. The vote ended at 11:14 in the morning. By 11:22, the 2 attorneys Carter had brought to the meeting had packed their briefcases and left the room without speaking to anyone, which is what attorneys do when the situation has moved past the point where speaking is professionally useful. Carter remained seated at the far end of the conference table while people filed out around him, not because he had decided to stay, but because he had not yet decided to leave, which is a different thing. And I recognized the difference because I had seen it in his face before, not often, but in the specific moments of his life when the path forward had become genuinely unclear to him, and he was waiting for his own mind to produce direction. Gerald stayed. When the room had emptied to the 3 of us, Gerald at his end, Carter at his, me in the middle, where I had sat through the entire proceeding, Gerald looked at me with the expression he had worn in the Stamford garage in February of 1990. The expression of a man who has arrived at something he has been working toward for a long time and is taking a moment to acknowledge that he has arrived. "The board would like you to consider resuming an executive role," Gerald said. "Not necessarily the CEO position. We are open to whatever structure makes sense. But Robert, the company needs someone at the center of it who understands what it was built to do. The board believes that person is you." I looked at the window. 6 floors down the loading dock was quiet now. The morning intake finished Building 7 running on its own momentum, the way things run when they have been built correctly and maintained consistently and trusted to do what they were designed to do. "No," I said. Gerald nodded once slowly, in the way he nodded when he had expected an answer and received it. "Is that final?" "I don't need the chair," I said. I never needed the chair. What I needed was for the truth to be in the room. It's in the room now. That's enough. Gerald looked at me for a long moment. Then he closed his portfolio, which with Gerald was always the physical signal that a conversation had reached its conclusion, and he stood and buttoned his jacket and extended his hand. 34 years, he said. 34 years, I said, and shook it with both of mine. He left the room. Carter and I sat at opposite ends of the conference table, in the quiet that followed the November light coming through the northeast window at the low angle of late morning in the middle of November, casting long shadows across the surface of the table and across the binder I had brought, and across the hands Carter had placed flat on the table in front of him, palms down the way a person places their hands when they are trying to feel the surface beneath them. "The board wants me gone by the 1st of the year," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "Diana is at her father's house." "I know." He looked at his hands. "She's not coming back." I did not answer that because it was not a question either, and because some things a person needs to say aloud in the presence of another person, not because they need a response, but because saying them aloud makes them real in a way that thinking them does not. The silence between us had a different quality than it had had at any point in the preceding 3 weeks, or the preceding 6 years, or the preceding decade of dinners at the Birchwood Drive house, where we had sat across from each other and talked about everything except what needed to be said. It was not comfortable, this silence, but it was honest, which was more than most of the silences we had shared in recent memory could claim. I stood up and picked up the binder. "Walk with me," I said. We took the elevator down, and walked through the main lobby and out through the glass doors into the November afternoon. The parking lot was mostly empty at this hour, the morning shift long gone, the afternoon shift not yet arrived, the campus in the particular between state of institutional buildings in the middle of a working day. Our breath made small clouds in the cold air. The elm trees along the perimeter had lost most of their leaves, and the ones that remained had gone past gold into the dry, papery brown of things that are holding on past the point where holding on serves any purpose. Carter's car was in the executive lot, the designated space with his name on a placard that had been there for 6 years and would be removed before the end of the month. He stopped beside it and put his hands in his pockets and looked at the space between us in the way people look at distances they cannot calculate. "I knew what I was doing," he said. Not a confession, not an apology. A statement of fact delivered by the man who had decided that accuracy was the only remaining currency available to him. "I want you to know that I knew. I'm not going to tell you I was confused or misled. Diana had influence, but the decisions were mine. The cold was specific and clean, the kind of cold that made everything feel precise. A single elm leaf detached from the tree nearest the lot and moved sideways in the air for a moment before it found the ground. "I know," I said. "I don't know how to—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know what comes after this." I looked at my son. At the 42-year-old man with his hands in his pockets, standing beside a car in a parking lot on a gray November morning, and at the 9-year-old boy underneath him, who had sat on a metal stool on a Saturday morning and asked exactly the right questions, and at all the years between those two people and what had happened in them and what had not. "You figure out who you are without the things you thought defined you," I said. "It's hard work. I recommend starting early." Carter looked at me for a long moment. Something moved in his face that I had not seen there in many years, not resolution, not relief, but the particular expression of a person who has just been handed something they did not expect and does not yet know what to do with it. He got into his car. I stood in the parking lot with the binder under my arm and watched the taillights come on red in the gray afternoon, and then the car moved slowly out of the lot and turned onto the campus road and was gone. Some distances cannot be closed in a single conversation, but they can be opened. And opening is where everything begins. December in Connecticut is a specific kind of cold, not the sharp, purposeful cold of November, which arrives with the intention of changing things, but a settled cold. A cold that has made its peace with itself and with the landscape it inhabits that lies over the fields and the stone walls and the old cemetery on Millbrook Road in Stamford, the way a hand lies over something it intends to keep. The grass between the headstones was the color of straw. The elm trees along the eastern wall had given everything they had to give and stood bare against a sky the color of old pewter patient, in the particular way of things that have learned that patience is not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. Claire drove. She had arrived at my house on a Sunday morning in the second week of December, with coffee in a thermos and the particular expression she wore when she had decided something and was not going to be redirected, which was an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself at certain points in my life, and because Margaret had worn it more often than either of us. She did not ask whether I wanted to go. She said she was going, and she said I should come, and she waited while I found my coat. We did not talk much on the drive up from Gaithersburg. Claire had always understood that silence between people who trust each other is not empty, but full. And she filled the 2 hours with the kind of presence that Margaret had also offered on long drives, steady warm, requiring nothing. The radio played something I did not recognize and did not need to recognize, and the Maryland landscape gave way to Delaware and Delaware gave way to the particular flatness of southern Connecticut in winter. And by the time we turned onto Millbrook Road, the sky had gone from pewter to the soft, diffuse white of a day that cannot decide whether it intends to snow. Margaret's headstone was gray granite, which she had chosen herself from a catalog in the spring of 2013 with the same practical efficiency she had brought to choosing kitchen appliances and laboratory equipment and everything else in her life that required a decision to be made and then moved past. The inscription read her name, her dates, and a single line that she had also chosen herself. She noticed what mattered. I had not fully understood that inscription when she chose it. I understood it now. Claire stood beside me with her hands in her coat pockets, and her shoulder close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of it through both our coats, and neither of us said anything for a long time, which was not silence in the prohibited sense but in the necessary sense, the sense of two people standing in front of something important and giving it the space it deserved. I reached into my coat pocket and removed the letter. Christine Holloway had given me a copy 3 weeks earlier after the shareholder meeting in the corridor outside the boardroom. She had handed it to me in a plain white envelope with my name written on the front in Margaret's handwriting, the letters leaning slightly to the right, the way they always had, and she had said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and I had put it in my coat pocket and carried it there for 3 weeks without opening it, because I had understood, without being told, that there was a specific place where it needed to be opened, and I had not yet been to that place. The paper inside had softened along the folds. The ink was the particular blue of the fountain pen Margaret had kept on her desk for 30 years, the pen I had given her on our 10th anniversary, and which she had used for everything that mattered to her. The handwriting was hers, completely unhurried, precise, slightly formal, in the way of a woman who had grown up in a household where handwriting was considered a reflection of character and had never entirely unlearned that belief. I read it aloud, because Claire was there and because Margaret had written it, knowing that someday someone besides me might need to hear it. "My darling Robert," she had written. "If Christine has given you this letter, then something has happened that I was not wrong to prepare for, and you have handled it the way you handle everything, by waiting until you understood it completely, and then doing exactly what needed to be done, no more and no less, which has always been one of the things I have loved most about the way you move through the world. I want to tell you something. I perhaps did not say enough while I was there to say it. You have spent your life building things that outlast you. The patents will outlast you. The company, whatever form it takes, will outlast you. But the most important thing you built was not in any laboratory or any boardroom or any filing with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. You built a way of being in the world that said the work matters more than the credit. The truth matters more than the convenience. The people who depend on you matter more than the people who impress you. I have watched you live by those things for 40 years. I watched you live by them in the garage in Stamford when you had $35 in your checking account and a borrowed centrifuge and more certainty than any reasonable person was entitled to. I watched you live by them when you were tired and when you were afraid and when the path forward was genuinely unclear. I watched you live by them when our son began to forget them, and I watched you choose even then to believe that he might remember. He may yet remember. That is not yours to control. What is yours is the choice you make about who you are, regardless of what he chooses. You have always made that choice correctly. I am telling you now, from wherever this letter finds me, that I saw you make it. Every time. You once told me that the most important thing a scientist can do is observe accurately. I have tried to observe you accurately, Robert, for 40 years. Here is what I observed: a man who built things worth building, who protected people worth protecting, and who loved his family with the specific, quiet, daily devotion that does not announce itself because it does not need to. That is the foundation. Everything else was built on top of it. I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. I am sorry I did not say it more plainly when I had the chance. All my love always, Margaret. I folded the letter along its old lines and held it in both hands for a moment. Claire was crying without trying to conceal it, the tears moving freely down her face in the specific way of a person who has given themselves permission to feel something completely. She did not wipe them away. She stood in the December cold with her shoulder against mine and let them fall, and I understood that she was not crying. Only for Margaret, or only for the letter, or only for the morning at the shareholder meeting, or the evening at the Whitfield estate, or any single moment in the preceding months. She was crying for all of it at once, the way grief and gratitude cry together when they finally find the same room. I placed the letter in my coat pocket and put my hand on Margaret's headstone for a moment. The granite was very cold. It was solid and specific, and exactly where it was supposed to be, which was the most I could ask of anything. She noticed what mattered. Yes, I thought. She did. The sky had made its decision while I was reading. The first snow of the season was beginning to fall, small and deliberate, the way things fall when they have been waiting for the right moment and have finally found it. It settled on the granite and on the dry grass and on Claire's dark coat and on the shoulders of my warehouse jacket, which I was wearing because it was the warmest coat I owned, and because some things you keep wearing long after the occasion for them has passed, not out of habit, but out of the specific understanding that who you are is not determined by where you are or what the room expects of you. Claire took my hand. We stood there until the snow had covered the ground entirely and the old cemetery on Millbrook Road was white and quiet, and the elm trees along the eastern wall were holding the snow. The way they held everything, with this patience of things that have learned to bear weight, and have never once been diminished by the bearing of it. I had spent 35 years building a company. Margaret had spent 35 years building something harder to measure and impossible to take away. She had always been the better builder. There is a grandpa story I did not expect to live. I built a company worth billions. I held 47 patents. I sat in boardrooms with senators and investors and men who believed that power was the same thing as worth. And the truest thing anyone said about me in all those years was said by a woman in a church dress who worked the morning shift and wrote down a sentence I spoke without thinking. The work needed doing. The shift was ending. Those aren't the same thing. I am not telling you this family story because I want your admiration. I am telling you because I made choices I cannot undo. I stayed silent too long. I trusted too slowly. I let years pass while my son forgot who taught him to ask the right questions. Do not do what I did. Say the thing earlier. Show up before you are needed. The people who love you should not have to wait for a shareholder meeting to learn what you are worth. God gave me Margaret. That was more than I deserved and exactly enough. This is a grandpa story about a warehouse jacket, a $40 receipt, and a letter written by a woman who saw everything clearly and loved me anyway. This family story belongs to anyone who has ever built something and watched someone try to erase it. If this reached you, leave the words, "I built this," in the comments. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is the moment. These stories are sometimes fictional, built for reflection and human connection. If that is not for you, no hard feelings, choose what serves you best. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know.